Okay, we're going to start the Chapter 5 lecture outline. Chapter 5 is on running water and groundwater. This will also be split into two pieces per the sample schedule. All right, so Earth as a system, so the hydrological cycle. You are going to have to know all parts of this hydrological cycle, so make sure that you read the book uh, in detail for this section. So this cycle just illustrates the circulation of Earth's water supply. You probably already know this, but most of the water on Earth is in the oceans. But what maybe you didn't realize was that even the small portion of Earth's water supply that is fresh water, so we're talking only 2.5% of the global water on the Earth is fresh water. Most of that is actually due to glaciers and ice sheets. And then another large proportion, 30%, is water that's in the ground that needs to be pumped up. And so only 1.3% of the 2.5% that's fresh water is actually surface water other than the fresh water that we're talked about here. So that's pretty unbelievable. So most of the Earth's water is salt water that's undrinkable. And even most of the fresh water that's available is contained either in ice or is underground. Kind of interesting. So there are different processes involved in the water cycle. You will have to know all five of these things: precipitation, evaporation, infiltration, runoff, and transpiration. So this is actually a nice graphic illustrating these things. So you have water from, oceans or even big lakes. So you have that water being evaporated into the air, which will create a moisture in the atmosphere, which could be then either precipitated back to the ground or it could stay up in the clouds. But then that precipitation comes down, and that could either then run off through streams, rivers, back to the ocean, or some of that water can infiltrate the surface of the earth and then add to the water table. And even some of that water can then come back up to the surface to form smaller lakes and ponds. So make sure you understand how this process works. All right, so running water itself is another huge topic in this book. We're covering all of Chapter 5. So you have to understand what a drainage basin is. So this is just land area that contributes water to a specific river system. And a divide, that just simply separates drainage basins. So typically these could be mountain ridges or any type of high altitude geographical region that just splits a region in terms of the slope and where gravity will pull the water into what river system. So just as an example, they're giving you the Yellowstone River drainage basin, which is part of a larger Missouri River basin, and then eventually that is into one of the largest in the United States, the Mississippi River drainage basin. So in eastern Pennsylvania, Scranton is actually in the Lackawanna River system, and then that changes into the Susquehanna River system, and then our water eventually goes all the way into the Chesapeake Bay. So we go from Lackawanna River to Susquehanna River to directly to the Chesapeake Bay. So that's our river basin. So our water here in northeastern Pennsylvania does not end up going into the Mississippi River. It's part of the Chesapeake Bay region, which is then obviously the Atlantic Ocean River basin. Oh, it's not a river, the Atlantic Ocean basin. All right, so in any particular river system, there's three zones that are important. There's the zone of sediment production, so this is going to be where the headwaters or the start of the river occur. So this is going to be in a mountainous region where you have a very high elevation. You're then going to enter a region where you're in the zone of transportation. So this is going to be the bulk of the river system that happens on more or less level ground with a very slow, gradual change in elevation. And then finally, you have the zone of deposition, and this is going to be at the mouth of the river. So wherever the river is emptying into or wherever the river is connecting with another river. All right, so there are different drainage patterns that rivers can form. So these are just networks of streams that form distinctive patterns from larger river basins. The drainage pattern varies by terrain, and there's four common types. You have dendritic, rectangular, radial, and trellis, and there's very nice diagrams illustrating the two. The top left-hand dendritic pattern, that's probably the most familiar one that you would ever see. It kind of looks like maybe like the pieces of a tree on a tree limb, or even the veins in your arm and in your body. So this is a very typical drainage pattern in our area. Then you have a radial pattern, which typically occurs near a very large mountain. It doesn't have to be a volcano in this picture, but it could just be a mountainous region where you have water coming from a source that's underneath that mountain. So you have a bunch of different rivers leading away from that high elevation point. Then you have a rectangular pattern, which is pretty obvious, and then you have the trellis pattern, which is a little different than rectangular. I think it looks like rectangular, but it has a lot, many more different tributaries, and the geography of that actual region is very different than the rectangular pattern. So stream flow. So there's factors that determine how fast water is moving within a stream. One of the largest is the gradient, or how steep the slope is in that region. There's also different channel characteristics like its size, its shape, and the roughness of the actual channel, and then its discharge. So this is the volume of water flowing in a stream. This is generally expressed in cubic feet per second. So how fast the discharge is will determine how the actual velocity of the water flow. So there's upstream to downstream changes that occur. So the profile of the river changes as you go from the head to the mouth. So typically at the source of the river, the gradient's very steep and its profile is smooth, and the gradient decreases as you go from the head to the mouth. And there's different factors that increase downstream, which would be the velocity increases downstream and also the discharge. So this is a nice plot that illustrates the changes from headwaters to the mouth of the river. So you're going to increase in slope and channel roughness as you get closer to the headwaters, or the head of the river. And then as you get closer to the mouth, the discharge, the channel size, so the width of the actual river, and the flow velocity increase as you get closer to the mouth or as you proceed farther downstream. So just know that roughness and slope get bigger as you go to the head of the river, and then discharge, channel size, and flow velocity get larger as you go to the mouth, and then everything else decreases. So another thing that increases downstream is the channel size. So the rivers get wider as you get farther away from the head, and then things that decrease downstream would be the gradient or slope, and then also the roughness of the channel. So here's a longitudinal profile of a stream, just showing you that the elevation is much greater near the head of the river, and the gradient or the slope of the river stays pretty large as you get a little bit farther away from the head, but then as you get closer and closer to the mouth, it dramatically starts to level out until you get all the way down to the bottom where you're at sea level, so then you're at an elevation of 0. So a large proportion of the stream only has a very small gradient. Only near the head of the river do you have a very steep gradient, and that's typically in a mountainous region. All right, the work of running water. So there's different types of materials that are called loads inside of a river. So you have three basic types. You have a dissolved load. So this graphic is showing you that it's invisible, and it just means invisible to the human eye. So these are just dissolved particles that flow in the river. You also have suspended load that you would actually be able to see with your eyes, so this would be some silt and clay. And you have the bed load, and this is whatever's at the bottom of the river flowing, and these particles tends to bounce against each other. They slide on the bottom of the river, and they also roll on the bottom of the river. This is just an example of a pothole due to erosion. So this is just abrasions that happen by long-lived whirlpools, or zones where you have water circulating in a circle at any location in the river. It can form potholes once the river in that region kind of dissipates and you're just left with a hole in the ground instead of having river. Okay, some more work of running water. You have transportation. So the load is related to a stream's competence, which is its maximum particle size, and also its capacity, which is its maximum amount of load it could have. And capacity is related to the discharge as well. You have deposition. This is caused by a decrease in the velocity, so those loads that are in the river can actually end up stopping and just falling on the bottom of the river, and they eventually could deposit and form layers and layers until it increases even more. And it's essentially when the sediment drops out of the river. And the stream sediment is known as alluvium, so make sure you know that word for the quiz in the exam. So stream sediment is known as alluvium, and these are just well-sorted deposits. So features produced by deposition, you might have something called a delta, which exists at oceans or lakes. So most large rivers have a delta at the end of it. So the Mississippi Delta is in Louisiana. Yeah, if you ever saw a picture of that, you would see that it's basically an area where sediment has been deposited, and it kind of looks like there's many small rivers at the end or at the mouth of your river. You have natural levees, and these form parallel to the stream channel. Areas behind levees may contain swamps or something called a Yazoo tributary. All right, there's 4 types of stream channels: bedrock channels, alluvial channels, meandering streams, and braided streams. Make sure you understand the differences between those 4. And this is just a pictorial example of a braided stream.